All right, I probably can get started. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the panel entitled Speak Your Mind, Diversity of Experiences in Academia. My name is Alaa Alsaafin, and I will be the chair for this session, which will start in a moment. And before we get started, I would like to thank the speakers and you, the audience, for your attendance and participation today. This conference would not have been possible without your support. Before I pass on the virtual mic to our speakers, I'd like to get some housekeeping items out of the way. So feel free to turn on your video, but please keep your microphone off while the speakers are presenting. And we've enabled closed captioning, and this you can enable by turning it on or off by clicking on the arrow next to the live transcript button on the bottom panel of your Zoom window and selecting like show or hide subtitle. We'll be recording and streaming the sessions, which is happening right now, and we will be stopping for the last part to be unrecorded, and this will be for the last 10 minutes of the panel, and you will have a notification come on Zoom when the session is being recorded or not recorded. We also want to provide you a trigger warning as sensitive topics may be discussed. And if any of these topics are triggering or upsetting for you, we encourage you to step away and come back as needed. And we also want to make sure that you know that this is a very supportive environment. That being said, we are not healthcare professionals and we do not provide counseling or therapy. And you can find resources on our websites at mindsinacademia.com/resources. And these resources have been compiled from all over the world. We also kindly ask you to please remain respectful of others, and inappropriate behavior or comments will not be tolerated, and they may result of your removal from the conference. And if you need help at all during the session, please contact IT in the Zoom meeting or email us at minds.conference@gmail.com. And if you have any questions at any point during the session, please message them in the chat on Zoom, and Maysoon, who is the panel moderator, will be able to read them out to the rest of the panelists. And if you want to be anonymous, feel free to either message me directly or Maysoon for any help. And with that, I would like to pass on the virtual mic to Maysoon to take over the session.
Thank you, Alaa, and welcome everyone, and thank you for attending and supporting us on today's session. So just a little about myself. My name is Maysoon, as I mentioned, and I'm based in Sydney. I am an independent consultant and also an educator teaching undergrad and postgraduate students. So before we get started, as you know, today we are talking about diverse voices of academia, with really a focus on mental health, and also what we want you to walk away with today is hearing some of the stories from the panelists who will be sharing some of the experiences that they've had in academia in terms of how they've tackled mental health, but particularly looking at some of the resources and the tools that they use to really overcome some of those challenges. So let's start. The first thing that I want to do is really introduce our panelists. I'm going to get them to really introduce themselves, but just really quickly, we have Emily over on our top right, who is based in Melbourne and is currently undertaking a PhD at the University of Monash and also a scientist. And I think, Emily, you know, if there's anyone who's tackled you know, mental health issues with what's happening in Melbourne, it's probably some of the harshest lockdowns, if not in Australia, probably in the world. I really feel for you, and you've just experienced an earthquake as well, which is very rare in Australia. So yeah, really looking forward to hearing more about how you've maybe faced some of those as well. Top left-hand side, we have Dr. Tara from Vancouver in Canada, who has a postdoctoral, is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of British Columbia, and we're really looking forward to hearing more about you, Tara. And then down the bottom, we've got lovely Syma, who's also sharing the city that I'm in Sydney. So Syma is a human experience researcher who's got quite an admirable mission, which is to leave the world in a better place than she found it, which I think we can all relate to. So what I'm now going to do is just hand over to each of the panelists and get you all to really introduce yourselves briefly, just to give the audience just an idea of a bit about your background and some of the just some of the things that you've been up to lately. So I might start off with Dr. Tara. Tell us a little about yourself.
Okay, I was not expecting to be first, so here we go. All right. Hi, my name is, you're confirming, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Hi, my name is Dr. Tara Dennehy, and I'm a social psychologist. I do research on stereotyping and prejudice broadly, and I'm particularly interested in how stereotypes impact interpersonal interactions. A lot of my work examines exclusion in STEM fields and in the workplace. That said, my research expertise isn't why I'm here today. I'm here as a disabled and queer academic who's dealt with structural discrimination and ableism in academia. And my experiences have led me to speak out increasingly about how academia actively forces out disabled and otherwise marginalized scholars. In addition to formal policies, a lot of this exclusion is driven by academic culture and the prioritization of productivity over people. Now, before I go much further, I want to address the breathing and speaking thing. So I have relapsing polychondritis, which is a rare autoimmune disease that attacks cartilage and cartilage-like tissue throughout the body. Unfortunately for me, that includes the airway, namely the trachea and bronchi and the lungs. And my oximeter is going off to tell me that I need to take a breath. So my relapsing polychondritis is called the cause tracheobronchomalacia, which is basically your larger airways collapsing. When a healthy person breathes out, their trachea, it bends a little bit. When someone with tracheobronchomalacia breathes out, their airway collapses. And I actually have 100% collapse. So this is what my airway looks like. So this tube that you see is actually a mouthpiece connected to a ventilator. When I'm having better breathing days, I can use this to help reopen my airway instead of wearing a mask 24/7. And if I get shorter of breath during the session, though, I may actually have to switch back to the mask. All right. So now, one of the reasons I wanted to speak on this panel today, despite being on medical leave and barely being able to speak, is to address what I see as a false distinction that gets made between the mental health and physical health. That little U is a union symbol, which I'm using as a shorthand to say we're thinking of these elements together as part of the same set. And I truly believe the following statement should not be controversial. Our brains are located in bodies. The cultures and environments we're in affect our bodies and minds. Mental health can affect physical health, and physical health can affect mental health. Although I wasn't diagnosed with relapsing polychondritis until 2020, I first began having symptoms decades ago, but I started getting much sicker during my PhD. In 2015, my health began to get precipitously downhill. I barely survived the final year and a half of my PhD. I tried multiple times to seek formal accommodations for my physical limitations, but was met with repeated barriers. So my health deteriorated more and more as I tried to keep pushing through. I've always been neurodivergent, and in academic context at least, I was excellent at masking because my strengths were sufficiently valued for a long time and managed to perform well simply by working harder and longer than anybody else. But my coping skills couldn't keep up as I got sicker. And before I got sick, I'd heard enough about how faculty talked about students who were disabled and or neurodivergent to be afraid of speaking openly about any of my more cognitive symptoms, either during my PhD or once I began my postdoc. So in addition to physical symptoms, my autoimmune disease has caused at varying times insomnia, extreme fatigue, severe brain fog, slow cognitive processing, anomia, having a hard time finding words, and pretty severe executive dysfunction, which includes working memory and emotion regulation. Now here's kind of a piece of commentary about academic culture. Everyone knows that PhDs are hard, right? So grad students suffer. And this conception is so normalized that for a lot of us, it's just accepted that you're going to have a hard time in grad school. And this extended to my doctors. They, for years, doctors attributed a lot of the symptoms I was having to me being in medical school. And for a time, I believed it as well. And as things got worse, and because grad school is so stressful, it was hard to get doctors to look beyond mental health explanations despite my worsening physical symptoms. So after I moved for my postdoc, I wound up having to agree to try an SSRI to get my doctors treating me. Even though at the time I was telling them I wasn't globally depressed, I thought I was burnt out and to a certain extent responding to kind of accumulated traumas from my PhD. The SSRI turned me into a zombie to the point it's now listed as an adverse reaction in my chart. And after that, I spent a year on an MDRI. So what finally began to help these symptoms, starting medications for my autoimmune disease. Unfortunately, by the time I was finally diagnosed, I'd gotten so sick it was hard to continue working even part-time. Tried working full-time for most of 2020, but earlier this year I had to go on full medical leave, and I don't know when or if I will be able to return to academia. So this is a little piece of my story, which I wanted to share to combat the normalization of suffering in graduate school and academia more broadly. But I'm also happy to speak to these other topics related to health and academic culture, kind of like ableism, the impact of discrimination on health and well-being, vicious cycles between discrimination and lack of support and burnout, stress, burnout, physical health, systemic factors, and more.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Tara. That's so impressive, so amazing. And it's just so touching, you know, just what you've been through and in such recent times, in such a short time frame as well. And just some of that feedback that you received, just that would have been so disheartening and so discouraging, knowing that it was more than what, you know, this whole idea around it's okay, you know, you're a grad, you know, you're a postgraduate, you're someone who's in academia, so this is quite normal. It's just, yeah, it's quite concerning that that's sort of the culture that we're dealing with. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I know that wasn't easy, but you did an amazing job and really appreciate it. I'm now going to move over to Emily King. Now, Emily is, you know, we're talking about diversity here, and obviously we just heard from Tara, who represents, you know, what we saw is the, you know, a community that of, you know, disabilities and some of the challenges that she faced. And we've got Emily, who, you know, it doesn't look like your typical sort of diverse person. You know, we're all female, which is quite diverse in itself, but, you know, that's 50% of the population. But, you know, we've all got our own elements that make us different. And Emily also has her own story to share, and, you know, she might be white, which we don't generally associate with diversity. But, you know, that's all part of the makeup of society. So, Emily, please share with us some of your stories and the relevance of when we talk about academia and mental health.
Thanks, Maysoon. And yeah, thank you, Tara, so much for sharing. I wanted to have that acknowledged because I know that I probably don't come across as the most diverse person, but I guess that's part of why I want to speak today, because I know that it can be very difficult for people to open up, particularly if they have an intersection of a number of different circumstances. And I guess I kind of want to use my position to help to kind of open up that conversation so that we can build, you know, reduce stigma, build an increasingly supportive environment, and help others come forward that maybe haven't felt like they could until now. So I really wish that I put some slides together now, because that was amazing. But I'm going to speak from the heart. So I guess I am a PhD student. I study within the realm of diabetes research, but like Tara, that's not really why I'm here today. I guess I feel like I represent, unfortunately, a very, very common community within academia, which is that of people that deal with daily anxiety and depression. So I was formally diagnosed with an anxiety disorder and treatment-resistant depression about 3 or 4 years ago. And it is something that had been a part of my life probably since I was about 12, but it was exacerbated within the graduate environment to a very debilitating level. So I will go into that in a little bit more detail in a minute, but I just wanted to say, I guess, as a result of my experiences, it has led me to want to be an advocate for mental health within academia. I think it's so important to have more of these conversations. And it's definitely been really terrifying starting to open up about it. I've written an article about developing a relationship with antidepressants and some of the things that you might want to start thinking about as you do that, because that is a journey in itself, and it's quite difficult to do that on the side of other commitments because it can impact your sleep and it can impact pretty much every part of your life. So it's like a second job on top of whatever else it is that you're doing. I have also joined the Voices of Academia team, and that is a volunteer team co-founded by Dr. Zoe Ayres and Dr. Marissa Kate, to help academics from around the world come together and try to discuss the variety of experiences that they've had. And that's in an effort to reduce stigma and kind of normalize difficult conversations and to help people feel less alone. So that initially started as a blog, and it's now expanded to a podcast. So I'm the podcast host for that, and I speak with, again, people from all around the world. And it's not just about their mental health stories, but it's also about how they have learned to manage and some of the barriers they've faced, but also anything that they would like to share to help others in a similar situation. So there are a range of, different stories that we've currently shared, and I'm really excited to sort of be a part of that. But yeah, I wanted to share, I guess, because my understanding is that it's quite rare to have taken a break from a PhD and then to have come back. I took over a year off my PhD, and I did return at the start of 2019. I initially returned, I needed it to be sort of exposure therapy because I was having anxiety attacks if I was anywhere near the institute. So initially I met with a graduate coordinator, once every couple of weeks, and needed to put a lot of support in place for myself to even be able to get to that meeting. And he initially just wanted to chat to me about how I was doing. And then the second time he wanted to chat to me about my research. And then he offered to help sort of be a moderator between myself and my supervisors to help me if I wanted to get back to my research institute. So I'd spend an hour at the institute just so that I could be in the environment. Eventually I started volunteering over a period of a few months, just for sort of a few hours at a time or half a day, and eventually worked up to returning part-time, which initially was 2 days a week at the start of 2019. So I was doing that for about a year, and then the pandemic hit, and that's created a whole lot of extra difficulties. I'm now back up to 3 days a week, but I still don't have the capacity to work full time. So I think if anyone, has considered taking a break, has taken a break and is finding it really difficult to return to that environment, I guess I represent, that side of things, and I can certainly provide, my experience on that. If you'd like to know more, I'm very happy to talk about it. But I guess a little bit more detail on my story is that I've probably been a very anxious person since I was about 12. And I didn't recognize it because I have a family that's not very emotionally supportive. They're not very emotionally intelligent, and they didn't recognize that. They didn't know how to support that. I actually didn't know until a few years ago how abnormal my family relationships were. I have a very fractured family, and I was essentially emotionally neglected by my family. So that's, I think, probably contributed. Wendy talked about how some of these conditions can be environmental, and I really wouldn't be surprised if that's kind of what contributed to mine. I think I probably started experiencing depression when I was about 21. So that's just over 10 years ago now. And it's kind of become more and more frequent and more severe after my, undergrad university, when I was working full-time, I was a medical rep. So, I didn't have to go into an office. It was very independent. And I would just not go to work some days and I wouldn't tell anyone. And for me, that's extremely strange because I'm very motivated. I'm very ambitious. I've always tried to work extremely hard. And so to just all of a sudden just have zero motivation and just not want to perform, it's just very, it's very different to what my normal way of being would be. So yeah, it really hit hard during my PhD. I guess I moved interstate for my PhD. So the isolation that can come with moving interstate or international, if any of you have done that. I had gone from working full-time to back to being a student. So there are a lot of financial adjustments with that. I was in a share house situation and I was living with an alcoholic. And while I understand that, there are lots of underlying conditions, underneath substance abuse, he wasn't getting help. And, I really didn't know him that well. And he was not paying rent. Sometimes he would come home and he would have had accidents and be bleeding. And it felt like quite an unsafe environment. And it kind of instigated a lot of anxiety and fear in my personal life. As someone that was financially struggling on a PhD stipend, and then for one of my housemates to be like, oh yeah, I can't pay rent this month. And so I was like, well, I can't cover you.
Yeah. Well, that would have made things easy then.
No, definitely not. I'll wrap it up. But my parents got unexpectedly divorced after a year and a half of my PhD. A lot of different sort of personal and professional circumstances led to me having sort of extreme burnout. I couldn't function. I couldn't do my PhD anymore. So I took some time off, thought it would be 3 months, ended up being over a year. I went through, started therapy and started medication, but didn't really receive a whole lot of support from the university environment. And I've since returned, which I mentioned earlier. So that's, again, just a brief snapshot of my story. But if you can relate to any of those personal life circumstances, and trying to mash that in with life in academia that's already hard enough, I see you. And
wow,
we can
thank you so
it.
much, Emily. That's just amazing. And just thank you so much for opening up, because I know that's not easy to do, and I can just see it, I can hear it. And I think you've touched us all, and I'm sure many who are listening, in so many ways. So just wanted to say thank you so much. Really appreciate your honesty and your authenticity in just sharing that. And I know, there's just, the challenges that you would have faced and still facing, obviously, but I think speaking out, obviously, and for others to hear some of the stories that you've been through. And I'll come back to this, I'll loop back to this, but what I'm hearing so far, I'm just trying to sort of pick up some of the common themes that I've been hearing, this culture that is, that sort of promotes potentially this, issues around mental health and isn't so supportive. But we'll look back to this. But I want to go to Syma. Syma, we've heard some, really deep stories already. Keen to hear what your experiences have been and some of the stories you can share with us.
Yeah, so, wow, first of all, thank you, Tara and Emily, for sharing your story with the kind of authenticity that you've shared your stories with. I know it takes a lot of courage to speak your truth. As far as I'm concerned, goodness, feels like I've lived a lot of lives, worn a few different hats. So born in Pakistan, educated in the UK and Australia. So my postgrad degrees were from there. So lived experience of living, working and studying in 3 continents, 7 cities. In terms of hats, I've been a consultant to big corporations, Fortune 500s, down to the smallest size corporations and VC-funded startups. And advertising industry experience as well, but I think the longest stretch, yes, of my career has been in academia. So 10 years there. And when we speak of mental health advocacy, my journey began with an experience of burnout during my master's thesis, which happened in 2017. And I was facing all the classic symptoms, which is lack of interest in things, extreme exhaustion, and cynicism. And that was causing a change in my personality, which I couldn't make sense of. I'm known to myself and others as a high achiever. That's how I operate. I'm very motivated. I'm very driven. And all of a sudden, I was this different person. I was also a young mom at the time. My kids were 7 and 4 years old. And going through that experience of the burnout, through the gaze of my little children, it was very confronting. It made me very vulnerable because my role had switched from being the nurturer and the carer to someone who was really struggling and then on a path to recovery. So, I mean, there is so much hope because with the right experts, you can be very well supported on your path to recovery. But my God, it's hard, right? With the burnout, I think the academic environment the culture was just so rife with all the factors that can push you towards a burnout. So very heavy workloads. I was researching, I was the project manager of a massive open online course, which was going to become world leading soon. And I was also a working mom and teaching at the same time. And I was going till I didn't have the will in me to drag myself out of the bed. And strangely, the university resources just didn't cut it for me. I had to hire a private psychologist. I was very fortunate in that regard that she was able to pick my burnout because it's often undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. And she's like, Syma, you've got all the symptoms of burnout. And I'm like, what is burnout? I think for 2017, that speaks to the state of mental health in academia. And so many times when I share my story, because I'm passionate about sharing story, because I think when we're able to talk about the story, we take the power away from the stigma and own that power. And people would ask, what is burnout? So it's intriguing. And right now, with my PhD, which I didn't set that timing, I started in January 2020 at the tail end of it. And in February or March, we were having our first Sydney lockdowns. And very quickly, I realized that I was part of a dysfunctional team. I wasn't getting the support that I wanted to get. My ideas weren't being received the way I wanted them to be received. And there's just a lack of responsiveness as we were increasingly operating in this very virtual world. And I chose to drop out in August 2020. And from then I have been a full-time entrepreneur where I'm working with other entrepreneurs to support their businesses. And also, as I said, I'm so passionate about mental well-being, and my journey there started with volunteering for Dragonfly Mental Health. And right now I'm working on this tech startup, and mental well-being in academia is one of the foundational pillars for that. So yeah, just raising capital for that and being a part of this awesome community.
Wow. Thank you so much, Syma. So touching again, and again, thank you for really digging deep and sharing with us what's on the surface of what's beyond the surface, actually. From what we're hearing. Look, what I'm hearing, I'm sort of listening to the stories, and one thing that's really standing out for me is there was a lot of talk about stigma there's this stigma attached to mental illness and so on. And, you know, you've all struggled to some degree with academia and the support that you probably should have received as you were suffering and facing some of those challenges. And I guess one of the questions that I have, and I'm going to sort of cross this across all of you, is, you know, is there something about the culture of academia that drives people down this path? Plus, is it that there's just no support at the moment? And I'm interested to understand also how you overcame or looked to what kind of resources were potentially available to you to get some of that support. So Tara, I know you spoke about, I know you haven't gone back since, you know, you obviously faced these health issues, but interested to know, you also talked about, you know, culture of academia, but what kind of support did you receive when, you know, you told your colleagues that you were facing health issues and obviously related to mental? How did they respond, and what kind of resources did you find to help support you along this journey?
I have to say, honestly, the responses weren't great. When you have a physical health issue, people are initially so sympathetic. Like, you know, oh, you know, whatever I can do to support you, you know, take all the time you need. That has a time limit on it. And I found that during my PhD when I got very sick at one point, well, at multiple points actually. And I found that in my postdoc, is that after a while, that sympathy, that willingness to give you time just goes away. And honestly, universities are not set up to support disabled scholars. In fact, they're pretty terrible at supporting disabled scholars. There isn't even really the notion of like part-time work. I mean, I'm actually kind of surprised, Emily, that you managed to do part-time work, because a lot of times we can't. And like, you know, funding schemes, everything is really set up to support people devoting their absolute 100% entire lives. And I have to say, when I was working part-time, I constantly felt pressured to work more than the hours I was supposed to be working. Sorry.
And so Tara, was this even during? Was this even during your diagnosis that you were still expected to do more?
So yes, I was diagnosed in January of 2020, and I was on part-time. I was supposed to be on partial medical leave pretty much all of last year. And I think, you know, I am complicit in the culture because I bought into it too. But, you know, I don't want to lose the authorship that I've been working toward. And it sucked so much to get demoted down on papers, as I couldn't put in the work that, like, I just couldn't spend the hours. I was working myself like ragged to the point where I was actually neglecting my health. Like, I wasn't able to keep up with all of the admin you actually have to do when you have a major health condition, whether it's a physical health condition or a mental health condition. There's lots of doctor's appointments. There's just so much care work you need to do. And I wasn't able to keep up with it when I was trying to work part-time, because I felt the pressure. Even sometimes it was explicitly external, but sometimes it came from me too. So I think that it's really hard to challenge this culture issue, because in academia, it all comes down to your productivity, and that is seen as your value. And I feel like there is this major problem of valuing what someone can produce over the people on your team. And, you know, if I manage to ever get back into academia, like and really return, my goal is to actually really try to build a lab where we value people over productivity and, you know, damn the consequences.
Wow. Do you know what's interesting? Because the stories that I'm hearing are quite prevalent, I think, across industry as well. But, you know, it feels like it's at another level at academia. But I might cross over to Emily. So I don't know whether any of you have recently come across some sort of stories around what's happening in China. So China have a very, very sort of intense work culture. where, you know, I don't know if you've heard of 996? You work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. So that's, you know, a cultural element of Chinese workers. And what we're now seeing is the younger generation, particularly sort of Gen Z, are actually rebelling against that, and they're leaving industry. They're saying, I'm just not living there. And you know, there were people who are literally dying on their desks from burnout. You know, Syma, you talk about burnout, and you know, no one's really talking about anxiety. And Emily, I was just listening to what you were talking about. You know, the stigma in academia. You know, this is starting to come to the surface, I think, across mainstream society, but we're not hearing enough of it in academia. So, Emily, how do you think institutions like universities are responding to these mental health issues that they're starting to potentially hear more about and experience?
Oh, that's a big question. Look, it's interesting because some of you might have seen if you follow me on Twitter, but just this week I had a lab meeting. So my lab is we're wet lab based. So we do, you know, experiments and that kind of thing. And, you know, we have a lab meeting maybe like once every 2 weeks. And they're generally very like productivity based, and you know, it's again about productivity, not people, right? So we're in the middle of our 6th lockdown in Melbourne. I think it was just a couple of days ago we became the city, or you know, also compared to countries, that has had the longest time in lockdown in the world, and it's also one of the strictest lockdowns in the world as well. And so our lab managers, you know, called this meeting to have a wellbeing, you know, meeting and just check in with people, which they hadn't done for the first 6 weeks of this lockdown. And it was scheduled for 20 minutes for a lab of 11 people. And I just kind of scoffed at it when I saw it, because I was like, that's not enough time to check in with like one person, let alone 11 different people.
Yeah.
And I decided that I was going to open up, because about a week ago, I reached mental and emotional capacity under the current circumstances. Even doing everything that I've learned to do to support myself, it's not enough. I've had to add more, and it's still not enough. And my partner is also struggling. And so I decided I wanted to mention that in the lab meeting, because I have started to speak out about this, and I feel more and more comfortable doing that. And I know there are a lot of people that don't feel comfortable doing that. And so I decided to raise it and just say, you know, if you've reached this point as well, like, you're not the only one, and I'm happy to talk about it, you know, happy to talk through what we might be able to do to help us work a bit more sustainably. And it just fell on deaf ears. Like, no one responded, no one really said anything like about their own situation. And I understand the fear about talking about that. But just the fact that, you know, even kind of the supervisors didn't really mention any of sort of what they're dealing with to help us build a bit of a community. Like, we have this opportunity to actually support each other through this. And instead, I feel like we're just being totally segregated. And, you know, my supervisor congratulated me on being involved in this conference, and sort of said, you know, you're doing some great stuff in that space. That's great. But none of it's really coming from the top. And if I speak on a wider level, so for my institute as a whole, not just within my lab, but the director has you know, acknowledge the mental health toll that this is having on people, generally more for working parents that are needing to juggle, you know, homeschooling as well as their work. And I can't imagine, you know, Syma, I don't know how you would have managed to do that. That just is so much. But, you know, that's not the only problem as well. You know, there are a range of different issues that people are dealing with. And these kind of token mental health days have been given once every couple of weeks, or, you know, once a month. But I even spoke to my supervisor about that. And I said, are you getting any support, you know, from the director? And he said, you know, like, no one's looking after my kids, you know, I still have to do this. And I think the culture of academia, even when we get given days off, like it's a lovely gesture. And I know not every institute has had that made available to them. But I think because of the culture of academia that we have to keep producing data, we have to keep, you know, applying for grants, we have to keep publishing papers, kind of discourages you from taking those days, even if they're made available. So, you know, I guess, yeah, that's a bit of my response to that question.
Yeah. So it's that hustle culture, isn't it? And that's just the way it is. And no one's really challenging that. So, I mean, Syma, you know, you're on a mission, and you believe that things can change. And we're hearing, you know, quite discouraging stories here. And it is quite embedded within culture. So, you know, it's sort of quite systemic. And where do you see the opportunity? Where do you see the change that can come out of academia?
Look, when I think of change, Maysoon, I think of change as a process of one firm step after another, and it's something as simple as that. And I'm just so in awe of the people who put this conference together, because this is essential, these conversations, and the fact that we're having these conversations with such courage is our pathway to the positive change that we are working towards. I think I can speak for all the panelists that we are a part of this panel and this conversation and conference because we want academia to do better for the humans in the academia right now and for the future generations. And in the midst of all the challenges, I think there's just so much hope. And the pandemic, actually, I think I just mentioned that in the chat, that I had an awakening during the pandemic. So the gifts of the burnout unexpectedly were me embracing my imperfection, becoming a practitioner in mindfulness and meditation, having healthy boundaries around me that are non-negotiable, and really keeping a good balance between rest and work. Recovery is essential. We've talked about this whole stigma around break as if that's a wrong thing to do. I mean, if you're on a mission to do the research to make the world a better place, you need to rest and recover. I mean, let's just normalize it. Why don't we normalize it? And then we've got, Emily pointed out, these token mental health seminars, which in my university, often the same 15 people would turn up to. In the pre-pandemic days, you go like, what about the rest of the hundreds and thousands of staff? Where are they? And it's so essential, you know, the mental health literacy and the mental well-being conversation, because as supervisors, as instructors, we're at the front line. So if we see someone struggling, instead of just handing them over to remedial services like counseling, I mean, thank goodness they're there. But what's wrong with the culture that so many people end up there anyway? I mean, can we stop that from happening? And can we start having those conversations where people feel that they belong, where people feel that they're seen exactly as they are? So Emily said that as a working mom, what was it like for me with the lockdowns? Kids were studying from home. I was the only working mom in my cohort. And I kid you not, people forgot to ask how the kids were doing. And I thought that was a bit full on, right? And with that present moment awareness, where you're in tune with yourself and you're listening and you're really paying attention to everything, that was such a big missing part of the story that I was like, I'm passionate about my research project. I'm absolutely passionate about it. But with this team in the current environment, is this the best time to be doing what I was doing was the question I asked myself. And my answer on many mornings was no, which was what led to me changing the thing. And I mean, there's the stigma around mental health, there's stigma around quitting as well. And I think what people forget is that it takes courage to stand up by your values and say, this is not right by me. And we sometimes miss that point. So yeah, I mean, just so much to think and do.
Yeah, it's fascinating though, isn't it? I think your point around putting up boundaries, but you know, in terms of change, like we're talking about real systemic change here that starts from the top. You know, back to Emily's point. You know, where is it coming from the top? You know, it's not about 20-minute catch-up meetings when you've got a group of 20 people. You know, that sends the message that I really don't care and it's not a priority. That's what that really does. So I think this is a conference like this, and the fact that you all are sharing such personal, deep stories is a start. You know, awareness, the fact that, you know, people can start relating to some of the experiences that we're hearing, I think is a start to change. That is going to be, you know, quite enduring, but it's a start to something. But what I'd like to hear is, what are some of the resources and tools that you used that, you know, you can share with our audience who may be struggling and may be facing the similar challenges that you might all have struggled with and continue? But what are the things that, you know, whether it's within the university itself, it doesn't sound like they're providing a lot of support really to overcome the challenges, but what are the different things that you're all doing? Dr. Tara, what are some of the things the tools that you might have looked to, resources, whether it's a university or external, that you can share with us?
Yes, so I honestly haven't found much in the way of support from the university. I will kind of call out one exception, is that UBC has recently formed a disability affinity group, but this is kind of led by kind of disabled faculty and staff within the university, as opposed to being like a university a university initiative, and I think that has been kind of helpful to connect with a bit. But honestly, I think kind of recognizing, I mean, I've been disabled for a long time, but I think actually really recognizing my position in the community and connecting with other disabled people has been tremendously helpful. And I think it's so amazing to connect with other people who just get it, who get what your experience has been. And so some of that has been, especially so I moved to Massachusetts for my PhD in the US. I moved to Vancouver for my postdoc, which, you know, is crossing a border. My parents my sister actually live in France. So like community is mostly online at this point. I also can't leave the house. I've basically been locked down since March 2020. So a lot of that has come through Twitter, through certain Facebook groups. I think that's really helpful. And during my PhD, I was seeing kind of a therapist who kind of helped me get through, like, from my qualifying exams through my dissertation proposal. But I unfortunately graduated from therapy right before my physical health really took a nosedive. So those resources were all very helpful. And I think connecting to other people can be really
social. The virtual world can be quite resourceful, can't it? Look, what we're now going to do is we're actually going to pause recording, and we're going to open up to questions for the audience. The one thing that's really come through is talk, and you know, there's probably a lot more out there who are probably experiencing exactly what you've experienced. So, you know, maybe it's time that we really got rid of that stigma that everyone's talking about, that, you know, you sort of just got to plow through and keep at it and keep going. And that's what's really causing a lot of this anxiety. I think that people are experiencing that idea that you're on your own, but what we're hearing is that you're not on your own. I think everyone out there probably has a story that they can share and that they can relate to. So look, let's just have some final comments that you might all want to share before we bring this to a close. So Emily, some final comments that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, I just said in the chat that I'm happy to continue these conversations on academic Twitter, and I've just put my Twitter handle in there because, you know, this really is just the start, and there's so much more we could discuss, and there's such a diversity of experiences even within this, you know, small group. I definitely think it's important to talk. I kind of want to address like a little bit of like the elephant in that, you know, it's easier to talk in these kind of supportive environments, but it's much more difficult to do that with supervisors and with other people at our own home institutions. And I have to admit, I actually don't know what the answer is because, like I said in the chat, if anyone saw, but I think that by me putting my health first and by choosing to do my PhD part-time, I'm probably killing my career within academia. And that's a pretty brutal consequence of doing that. And it's been, as a high achiever, you know, that's been a really, really difficult decision to make. But I just don't see how I could continue the way that I was continuing. And that's a very personal decision that I've made for me. It still hurts. And I hate to bring it up to indicate that academia, that's kind of still where I feel it is. But I think for me, you know, if I decide to leave when I hopefully finish my PhD, because I'm stubborn, I think I would like to help to contribute to, you know, moving forward in this area from external to academia, because I think it will be easier to have an impact on the industry once I've left and have a little bit of a better work-life balance and have more capacity to contribute to this than it will be to do from the inside. And I hate to kind of end, I guess it's a bit of a negative note, but I think it's also realistic. And that's the decision that I have made for me.
Great, thank you so much for that, Emily. And that's quite disturbing. It's quite disturbing, but I'm glad you've raised it because that's a reality. But I think the fact that it's out in the open now and people are talking about it, that could be the start of a change. So let's hope that, you know, you speaking up and potentially killing your career might create careers for others in academia for futures to come, for generations to come. Syma, final words?
Oh, I don't think you're killing your career at all, Emily. It's just, you know, transitions are really hard, you know, and I speak from having transitioned through a range of things, you know, countries, my role in life and states, what have you. I think my final word would be that, you know, let's just collectively work towards mental well-being in academia. People don't have to do it alone. Let's not push people towards getting sick, for heaven's sake. You know, we as part of the community, it's just such a big responsibility we have in the academic environment to question the status quo, to be able to start a path forward, which is more positive for everyone.
Yeah, great, thank you. And you're absolutely right. Academia should be at the fringe of change. You know, it should be the leader, the pioneer. So yeah, I think it's concerning to hear some of these stories that are happening in an institution where, you know, it should be the pioneering of change to come in society. So let's hope that you're all part of that collective movement. Tara, some final comments?
Yes, I agree with what Emily said about, I'm fairly certain that my academic career has been ended by my medical leave. So I'm not really sure that there's a place in that the academia will be willing to make a place in like a research institution for someone who's had such a huge gap in their CV and whose productivity kind of suffered for so long. That said, I want to try to kind of switch to what we can do. You know, there's things we have control over, there's things that we don't. And I think one thing that we have control over is to try to let go of kind of, I keep hearing these themes of kind of shame and feelings of stigma. And while we can't control other people, we can try to let go of those feelings of shame ourselves. You know what, if your brain isn't working right, like you deserve compassion. Like you really do, you deserve compassion and empathy, and you deserve to be able to have a break and to be able to take care of yourself. And I think that what we can try to do is the more that we talk about this and the more that we try to spread norms of like caring for ourselves, of compassion, of like making space in academia for people who can't and also just don't want to follow kind of this traditional academic prototype. I think that the more that we can do that, kind of the better, and ultimately like the more people working towards this, we will hopefully create a more inclusive academia.
Great, thank you so much, Tara. And you're absolutely right. If you're not well, you absolutely deserve compassion, nothing less. And I think it's fantastic that there's been these collective voices that we've just heard in the last hour of everyone opening up and sharing their stories and experiences. And that's just so generous of you all, and just, you know, done in such an authentic and real and deep way. And yeah, just really want to thank you all so much for your contribution to this conversation.
Thank you all so much for being here. And yeah, so we'll have the next session in about half an hour-ish. So we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.